As you know, money makes the world go round, but also money messes with your mind. And the combination of those two things made economics pretty blind to the natural world and what it did to social relations and social capital.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Per Espen Stoknes. Per is an accomplished author and professor who brings a unique blend of psychology and economics expertise. In this discussion, we talk about the psychology of climate change, things like blind spots, defense mechanisms, and what's leading us to such disastrous collective outcomes. Per offers what is essentially a psychological diagnosis of the patient of capitalism, and let me warn you, it's not very good. We discuss what the field of economics misses in its basic definition of money. And I think this is so important because as we design new currencies and value exchange through crypto, we need to understand what the current system leaves out. We get into Web3, and Per really surprises me with his openness and embrace of the field. This conversation is somewhat heady and geeky, somewhat technical, but if you're interested in the field of ecological economics and regenerative finance, I definitely recommend it. It was recorded at the Eco Weaving Gathering at Wilbur in May of 2023. On to the show with Per Espen Stoknes. Welcome to Per Espen Stoknes. Per is an economist psychologist, or a psychologist economist, I guess, depending on how we frame it. And with a big heart for nature, welcome, Per.
Pleasure to be with you, Matthew. Really looking forward to this conversation where we'll dig into some topics that are so central to my heart and engagement.
Yes, I'm very excited about it as well. I mean, so much of this interview series has actually centered on so many of the collisions that you've spent your career exploring, especially around kind of nature and finance and the psychology of money. Can you tell us a bit about your background and how you come to this work?
Love to. So I originally studied Jungian psychology, also in Zurich, at the Jung Institute. And when I got back to Norway, I got in touch with a Norwegian philosopher. His name was Arne Næss. He founded deep ecology, or the environmental philosophy. Jung spoke about that we have a larger self, that is the context and the full potential of your being to which the ego relates. Arne Næss spoke about that we have not just a little self, as he called it, but a big ecological self, meaning that we're inextricably entangled with nature, the water you drink, the air we breathe, the food we eat, the landscape, the mountains that contain our landscape which we're in. So those two things came very clearly together to me, and I thought, this is what I want to work on. And that was in the early 90s when the climate thing was taking off. So I started studying how people relate to nature, how people relate to climate. And a big kind of taking off point for me was the Global Climate Conference in Copenhagen in 2009. After 20 years approximately of climate discourse and conflicts and discussions, there was a lot of hope associated with that. Now, finally, the world will get its act together and make a climate agreement. So Copenhagen conference was dubbed Hopenhagen, more or less. And unfortunately, I was there. I went in a demo with 100,000 people. This was 12 years or 10 years before Greta Thunberg. We went in demo. What do we want? Climate action. When do we want it? Now. All those things. And what happened? It fell apart. So we went from Copenhagen to Nopenhagen, and I decided I'm going to drill even deeper into this now, the relationship of humans to these larger global issues of climate. Why is it that our brain has such difficulties as individuals and organizations in really taking in what we're doing to the earth? What are the psychological barriers, the filters, the inner defenses that keep us from taking it to heart and then responding? Because as Arne Næss and Jung told me, it's not something out there. This is us. We're doing it to ourselves, but we're blind to what we're doing it to ourselves. So some kind of weird self-destructivity, suicidal something, darkness there. What is it? How does it work? So I decided I'd go deeply into it. And I spent 5 or 6 years researching a book, and from there came the TED Talk, and from there, well, now we're speaking about the psychology of it. So,
the book one of your books, I think it's one of the most clever titles I've ever heard. What we think about when we try not to think about global warming, toward a new psychology of climate action. So what were some of the key messages that you tried to convey there?
Yeah, so to pick up from a little story I gave you of Copenhagen, right after Copenhagen came the financial crisis, and also there was a backlash on the climate issue. It was called Climate Gate. So it was a kind of conspiracy theory that the climate scientists were making up the crisis.
Right.
So what we could see from the surveys was that engagement in climate built all through the 2000s to a peak around 2008 when Al Gore came up with the Inconvenient Truth film, and the IPCC won the Nobel Peace Prize. And then afterwards, it just collapsed. So people didn't want to think about the climate. It was okay as long as it was a kind of upgoing, hopeful thing. But as soon as now there was the finance, now it was unemployment, it was terrorism, it was all other things that came to the highest level of concerns. So when you ask people, what are the major threats that our country is up against, or major concerns, then you would have health, unemployment, terrorism, maybe education, and then on the 9th or 10th place came climate, or the state of nature, environmental issues, which is, for any natural scientist absurd, because if we don't have a livable climate and a livable ecosystem, we're all, we don't, So here's a short summary of the main messages. What do we mean when we say the psychology of climate? And it boils down maybe to 4 main dimensions of attitudes. This is how I relate to climate. The first is, do we have serious global warming? Yes or no? So is climate change real? The other is, who did it? In other words, is it anthropogenic, as the scientists say? Is it human caused? Is it the fossil fuels? Yes or no? Could be natural cycles, because some people have fun to say, well, look at the history of the Earth. Climate has always been changing, so this is just another cycle. The third dimension is, how serious is it, really? And that relates to the question I was speaking about. Is it more important than healthcare? Is it relatively more important than terrorism? Is it more important than unemployment, inequality, international threats from China, Russia, whatever, if you're American? So it is a question of, given that there are many concerns, which one should we really focus on? And then, even if you agree that climate is a major threat, which Americans today do, And most now, finally, even the Anglo-Saxon speaking world have come around, despite of Murdoch and despite of Anglo-Saxon countries have been those with the lowest degree of concern and the highest degree of skepticism, by the way. So we can go into that if you want. But beyond that comes a fourth dimension. And this is something that I've been spending the recent 10 years on, and hopefully this interview too, is can we solve it? And does it make any dent if I do something or not? So what's your perception? What's people's perception? Can we reach the Paris target, meaning keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, or not? Because if we don't, why bother? I mean, if civilization is going down the drain anyway, why not focus on things that are fun, like art, my house, my family, whatever I like. So to sum it up, in our brain, there are 4 dimensions. Is it real? Is it us? Does it really matter? Is it important? And finally, can we solve it? And that makes it a bit more nuanced, because now if you interview people over the world, everybody more or less says we have global warming. We won that discussion. We didn't do that from 15 years ago. There were still some, but now more than 90% of everybody in the world, even higher in most countries, 95% say there is global warming. So that's one. We don't have climate denial in the sense that a lot of people say there is no global warming. The problem isn't that. The problem is that we like to think that it's not us. It's not my car. It's not my plane ride. It's not the way I eat. It's the way I eat. It is natural cycles maybe, or some combination. Maybe it's a little bit of human caused, but it's also natural. So I step back from it. And when I do that, then the concern goes down. Now we need to focus on real quality education, or we need to be worried about trans people's access to public toilets or other social issues that have a high significance. And climate, again, goes down. And particularly then, if you don't feel that we have any solutions, you don't see any clear pathway to solving it, then it doesn't matter anyway, because, we've learned psychologically to focus on things that are within my scope of influence. So what I can do something about is important. What I can't do something about, I distance myself from it. And of course, if everybody believes that, we can't reach it anyway.
Right.
Yeah. So those are the 4, that's how it looks if you do an X-ray of the human mind. These are the 4 dimensions. And what we see is that we've won number 1, we're stuck on number 2, I haven't moved that far on number 3, even if there is movement, but the thing that's moved the needle the least maybe is the 4th. So there's this sense of it doesn't matter, because that thing is, we're done.
Right. I guess I am surprised to hear you say how much on the first point 95% plus of the world, has come around to the idea of global warming is real. Maybe I'm overly indexing to just rural environments or YouTube comment sections, but I still see a lot of skepticism even of that first question. And I do sense that there is a consistent thread of suspicion that is kind of intermixed between suspicion of top-down, large-scale governmental voices and institutional power, both in private sector and public sector. It's like this being told by a group of scientists in some far-off place that their model says that by this year, far off into the future, at these degrees and there's just something at a gut level that I can identify with that's just off-putting, and I think there's distrust, and then there's also like a genuine sense of humility that humans cannot be so all-knowing, and so that when we hear messages that are so confidently stated that the end of the world is coming by 2030 because of 2 degrees instead of 2.1 or 350 parts per million. Oh wait, no longer is it about 350 parts per million. Now it's about 400. No, now it's gonna be about 450 parts per million. It's like it just feels hubristic, and I'm curious, like that dimension of skepticism that. Because I feel off-put even more when I hear then it's like, oh, if you don't believe in global warming, then you're just ignorant. And it's like, no, there's real, I think, important shreds of truth and authentic skepticism, humility, questioning of these narratives that needs to be fully felt and addressed before we can all get more on the same page. I'm curious how you think of all of that.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of surveys, my friend and colleague Tony Lyserowicz at the Yale program of climate change communication does both national surveys of the US and internationally. So just have a look there and you see the numbers.
Got it.
But your question is very important and very pertinent as to why is it happening and why are we still hearing all those things? So what I gave you first was a kind of an X-ray of the human brain on climate, but let's get into the dynamics.
Right.
Why is it with these terms? Why do you feel that uneasiness and want to do a pushback or question or this hubristic and also the arrogance of a lot of the climate scientists? You know, if you don't agree with me, you're a jerk. That's in essence what a lot of people hear, and of course that's very uncomfortable to be subjected to that arrogant, top-down, I know better, you're ignorant type of communications.
Right.
So how does the human brain react when you get to issues such as that? Yeah, now we're heading towards 420 ppms of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is the highest in 3 million years, and we're now condemning 12% of the world's forest to extinction by 2030. How do you know all these things? There's a resistance to taking that in. And in psychology, resistance is very important, understanding how resistance goes, because, I mean, that's the beef of psychotherapy. If it was easy to change yourself, we wouldn't need psychotherapists. The reason why it's hard is that we have this resistance built in. And how does the resistance to taking genuine climate action look? What are the main defenses that that makes us pull up when we hear those kind of messages? And back in the 2000s, there wasn't a lot of research, but gradually towards after Copenhagen, and a lot of psychologists were starting to look into this. So what I did in that book, what we think about when we try not to think about global warming, was to condense about 350 articles that I could put my hands on into a very simple model. Because the psychologists, a little bit like the climate scientists, they were publishing the results in obscure journals with a very complex language and significance levels and all that lingo that scientists find important, but it was utterly useless for journalists or politicians or NGOs or anybody who cares. How should we communicate this? So the model I came up with had 5 defenses, 5 Ds as I call them. The first is distancing. The other is doom. The third is dissonance. Fourth is denial. And the fifth is identity. I don't know if you want me to dig into one of them, or should I do the quick version of all 5?
Well, I was going to say we can pitch also that if people want to listen to a very succinct 15-minute dive into all 5 and the reframes for all 5, they can check out the TED Talk, which has now garnered millions of views and seems to have a lot of timelessness. I just watched it again this morning. It's called How to Transform Apocalypse Fatigue into Action on Global Warming. We'll put a link into the show notes. But maybe if you just want to highlight one of them to give a sense of what you're talking about there.
Yeah, so let's do the 5th one, because that's the most deep and the most difficult one to actually address. So when you hear a climate scientist saying, you're rich, your carbon footprint is way over what is morally defensible. The 10% richest in the world are killing off the world, while the 50% poorest. And you're eating, you're flying, your car, your house, you're doing it.
Right.
Now, even if the climate scientist was more, shall we say, moderate than I was being right now, just pointing to the charts and statistics, I feel attacked. I feel bad. I feel as if now it's no longer about climate science. Now it's I'm down and you're up. I mean, you're having the moral high ground, and I am criticized for my lifestyle, who I am, my worldview, my knowledge, and so that's an attack on my self-image, my sense of identity, my values. I may be very proud that I have a job in a tech company that helps providing better designs to the world. I may do a lot of good in terms of assisting my kids and NGOs or sports or whatever, but this guy just tells me I'm bad. So now I will feel a need to hit back. And that's where climate discussions typically go bad, when they are transformed from a discussion of climate systems to lifestyles and who has the moral high ground. And of course, the left and the liberals have done this for 20 years now, trying to tell how bad the conservatives are, the business people are, the bankers, or the energy companies, or whatever. And it's very polarizing. So it's been caught in that self-destructive polarization, where if I say something that you feel as a criticism, you feel immediately the urge to criticize me back. And what we need is to get out of that vicious, self-destructive, polarizing type of climate debate. By the way, debate is an interesting word, because it comes from the word bat, actually, and D means down, and bat is a bat, so I hit you down with a bat. That's what's a
Wow, I didn't realize that. Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing is that we should not be using so much direct personal, shaming and guilting as the mechanism for hitting against whatever argument that we don't agree with, but that really collective climate action requires some other approach of meeting one another and maybe having a more objective view of the situation we're in.
Yeah, and also a new story about how we create a high quality of life, low material impact society, which would be better for everybody, both you and me. And how can we see that there are a lot of solutions that we need everybody on board for, in terms of turning that current system quickly enough around to something that fits within the planetary boundaries. And that's a fascinating, exhilarating, meaningful task for whatever profession you have, whether if you're a hairdresser or a pilot or a petroleum engineer or whoever you are, you can participate in this very necessary and very dignified purpose. Everybody loves nature. Everybody loves beautiful animals and a beautiful lake, and look at all this, It's not that people hate nature. You love a blue sky, you love watching the clouds and the sound of a waterfall.
Right.
Why don't we create that beautiful world, you and I? That's a very different conversation from what happens usually.
Totally. Well, and you also, beyond just writing the books, you've been teaching at a business school for a long time, the Center for Green Growth at the Norwegian Business School. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so going back to my history as a psychotherapist, I'm used to sitting like this with somebody and listening to them. Now you're doing the other way around.
We'll get on the couch after this. Yeah.
So I worked for, I don't know, maybe 7 years, groups and individual therapy. And gradually I was more and more frustrated because I felt I was sitting on the receiving side of a sick system. So people were burnt out, people were depressed, there were eating disorders, there were fallouts with your boss, and you were out, you got a sick leave, and the minute you got back to work, all your symptoms came back, and you were again, and then you lost your job. Because at work or in school or even with families, the share or the little part of myself that is accepted was like just a little bit of my whole myself. So people were overexploited on their clever, high-performing, numerical or just duty delivering type of resources, inner resources, and exhausted. So I recognize that in business, in even public sector, there is an extractive mindset that it exactly mirrors what we're doing with nature. So we have a type of economy, a type of organizational setup, key performance indicator, whatever it is, that focus on something that extracts value from a little bit, but then the rest of the system gets sick. So I decided, rather than doing psychotherapy on individuals, I'm going to do psychotherapy on mindsets or executives and see if I can change the way they perceive both inner and social resources and outer resources, to see that if you optimize the whole system rather than overexploit just a little part of it one-sidedly, then you get a whole more long-term value creation and a better value creation. So that's why I quit psychotherapy, and then I went to do, in my mind, I didn't say that to the executives or the economist, I'm doing psychotherapy on the economist or the economic thinking, because they think they are normal, healthy, but they're deeply pathological. So how can we address the pathology of economic thinking? And that's why I went into business schools. So I did scenarios, strategy, sustainable business models, circular economy things, and see how we can integrate nature and social issues into a more long-term business operations and strategy. And that's I've been teaching for about 15 years now.
Nice. Okay, let's go deeper into, tell me more about the pathologies of economists.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, finally got to the topic you really want to talk about.
Oh, yeah. There's such a huge amount. To take one, the view of the market. How did economists come to think of markets as price equilibrium mechanisms? Because that's what it is. The first thing you learn on Econ 101 is the holy supply and demand curves. And an efficient market is an equilibrium, and politicians should stay out of the equations because market and supply and demand will counter each other immediately and efficiently into the price equilibrium point. That is a weird way of viewing the world, and it becomes a pathology when it becomes fundamentalist. So let's do, for instance, quickly a view on, let's say, whatever market, kindergarten, for example, children. A psychologist, you know a little bit about, going into a kindergarten, let's say you deliver your kid, would look at how does this kindergarten teacher, whatever, the person working there, relate to the kid? Is it from the top down? Does it sit down? Is there eye contact? Is there empathy? Is there room for experiment? How does it react when the kids are angry? How is emotion contained? That's a way to look at kindergarten. And psychologists can become fundamentalists on their part, just to mention that. But imagine you're a sociologist and you enter a kindergarten. What do you see? Well, I see the type of clothes the parents are having when they deliver the kids, the type of cars, what class of people deliver their kids here, and where is this located in the city? So what type of vocabulary or social signals are embedded in the way this kindergarten presents itself. It's a kind of a hip, cool new place, or is a creative, little bit, what's the right word? Alternative type of thing, or is it a solid Christian, whatever, what category, social category? You're with me. I can go endlessly.
Yeah.
A philosopher would enter a kindergarten and say, okay, so what are the values that this kind of embodies, and what are the existential implications of having kids delivered by their parents into care of some external person? What does that do to their worldview? Now, an economist, which has the right view, would notice the price. So what is the daycare price? What's the quality of this one relative to others? And then what is the supply and demand of kindergarten? Are there too many kindergartens here? Are too little? How many kids per teacher? What's the cost of each child relative to the cost of the teachers? So suddenly, you're no longer seeing the kids. I'll say that again. Suddenly, you're no longer seeing the kids. That's the pathology.
The pathology being that economics abstracts things to a layer of finance and numbers and disconnects us from the reality of what we originally were trying to
The
view.
living world of kindergarten is reduced to an issue of supply and demand. And the reason this happened was that since Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, and this famous thing about the invisible hand, he was really unable to describe how the invisible hand worked. So there was this paradox of value that he couldn't resolve. But in 1880, about that, there were two economists, Walras and Jevons, who studied, among other things, physics or thermodynamic physics. That was Newtonian physics. And they noticed how the regulator in the steam engine, there would be a pressure from the steam against the work done by the machine. And that was formulated mathematically by thermodynamic formulas. And then one bright day, Walras came out of bed and said, I've got it. Now finally we can explain the social universe by the same formula that we're explaining the physical universe. The movement of the planets, the power of how the steam engine works, everything can be reduced to the issue of the calculus of supply versus demand. And by this now we can finally put science, economics, on a sound scientific basis. And from there came the quantification that made towards people like Samuelson and Michael Friedman and all the other mathematical oriented economists. They said, we don't have to care about institutions or history. All you need to do is have a proper understanding of supply and demand formulated mathematically, and we can extract the most crucial insights from the complex social world. And now economics can be the queen of the social sciences because it can explain everything with reference to our beautiful mathematical formulas. And that's what happened. And from that time, the history of economic thought went down the drain, and institutional economics went down the drain, and we had the neoliberal world where all values are reduced to an issue of supply and demand. So price becomes the measure of all values by its capacity to mediate between supply and demand. That's the economic worldview. And of course, there's a lot of intellectual insight in there, but the problem is that the pathology, since you asked me about that, is that it's become fundamentalist. So if there is no price, it doesn't exist. If there is some quirk on the supply side, you have to address that so it works perfectly and addresses to my fantasy of what an efficient market should look like.
Right. So what has led to that fundamentalism in your mind? Because the discipline of economics isn't necessarily the problem, right? I mean, it's there can be a philosophical lens, there can be an economics lens, there can be a psychologist lens into that kindergarten, right? But what you're suggesting and what I'm hearing is that we've made the economics lens front and center to everything.
Yeah.
And that this market fundamentalism is a root of our ecological crisis. I'm putting words in your mouth, but that's what I'm getting.
But that's exactly right. And what happened was that as the economies went into growth overdrive mode after the Second World War, gradually those with the largest growth became the most powerful. Those with the most money became the most powerful individuals, and those who had decisions not over how a kindergarten teacher is educated, but how money is allocated, they ended up with the power. So economics became coextensive with the power networks in society. And as you know, money makes the world go round, but also money messes with your mind. And the combination of those two things made economics pretty blind to the natural world and what it did to social relations and social capital. Of course, many economists would disagree with me in that. However, the field of something called environmental economics is a subdivision of mainstream economics where you apply supply and demand, the mainstream methodological approaches of cost-benefit analysis to nature. So then the economists say, well, it's up to the politicians. Just tell us what is the right target for emissions, what is the right target for nature, and then we will use supply and demand and cost-benefit analysis to calculate the most effective instruments to reach that target. But it's up to the politicians to set that target because it's not part of economics. And then once you've set that we can't have more than 5 million tons of emissions or we need 10,000 hectares of intact forest, we will simply supply the most economically efficient tools to deliver that target. But that's not up to us, that's the politicians. And if the politicians don't give a proper target or implement the price and the tax that we recommend, then it's the politicians' fault. So it's a blame game now. We're the pure scientists, we are delivering the premises, money markets work efficiently as long as the politicians do their job and put the target and then implement exactly what we say. But if the politicians don't do as we say, too bad.
Right.
So in that way, by using the mathematical approach, they have carved out a space for themselves where they are inassailable and don't have to take responsibility for the messy world, where there is competing priorities, where there are interest groups that are disagreeing, or there are perverse incentives. All that is pushed out of the pure, holy field of efficient economics over into the dirty world of politics. But of course, any field, whether psychology, of economics, or philosophy, do have to take that messy world into account. And economists have just kind of withdrawn to their own clean mathematical space where they have control on the spreadsheet and then wash their hands if people don't accept their superior insight and wisdom. Since you asked me about the pathology, now you get
well,
it.
I want to stay on it for a moment as well, because another pathology that I've heard you articulate very eloquently is the distinction between stocks and flows, and I'm wondering if you can share more on that.
Yeah. So there is this tension within the economics field of those who would prefer a capitalist approach versus those who prefer, let's say, a flow approach. So most famous in the economics world is Partha Dasgupta, with what is called the capitalist approach to national wealth. In politics and in the media and in a lot of economics as well, it is the question of flows. So it is who grows, what's the GDP, what's the annual improvement in services or inflation or all those things. So there's a lot less focus on the national wealth relative to the national change in the gross domestic product, the GDP. That is also just a distinction between flows and stocks on the financial or monetary type of value. In addition, we should have proper material flow accounts and then a ecosystem stock account, which says something about what is the current status of our freshwater systems, our forests, our nutrient flows. So all those things that relate to planetary boundaries should be firmly put on a part of the national wealth. Now, the the World Bank, along with Partha Dasgupta, tries to put a value on these things. So what is the price value of forest? What's the price value of fresh water? What's the price value on mining in the ground? And then convert that into national wealth. But what they're doing then is making the forest, value of the forest, equivalent to the value of roads. You measure both in dollars. So we may have 10 billion worth of roads and buildings, and then we have 500 million in forest, because you put a shadow price on the forest, and the value of the standing forest is much less than the value of cars and roads. So if you make more roads, you grow your national wealth beyond.
So what you're saying is it's kind of like the difference between a profit and loss statement and a balance sheet, where we've become fixated on the profit and loss of this quarter, this year. This is the flow of the revenue minus the costs, or the economic growth of the country, and the balance sheet or the national wealth. What we need to be addressing is that the natural capital, the stock of what are the intact forests, what are the intact watersheds and ecosystems, and but when we put a price on those things, and we start saying, well, the forests are worth $5 billion and the watersheds are worth $10 billion. And then we go over here back to our P&L and we say, okay, well, how do we speed up this quarter's profit and loss performance? And how do we do better? What we're doing is we're carving out of our stocks, because we have converted the language of natural capital into financial capital, and essentially created the same unit of measurement. And so now all of a sudden a Ferrari is worth more than a tree. And it's like, well, so let's make more Ferraris, because that's how we grow our P&L.
And we can even cut down the trees, so we can have both Ferraris and timber, and that's even better.
Right. Right, because a standing tree is not worth nearly as much as timber. Right.
So we, as you say, we get over-focused on the short-term flows. And in a way where money messes with your mind, in the sense that what the flows that I have now seem to be much more alive and important and vigorous and vital to me than a standing stock of something else. And this builds on a tendency in the human mind and brain that we are short-term. I mean, psychologically, we know that from experiments, that if you don't give a proper context, both kids and grown-ups would prefer to have benefits now rather than uncertain benefits, even if bigger, long into the future. So we are inherently not rational. We are short-term focused. And then when you put rapid money flows and growth and the feedback that this gives you, if you grew your salary with 100% last year, you were making it. That takes an extraordinary amount of psychological attention. So we need stories, frameworks, accounts, and values that help us remind ourselves that we only have those flows as long as the stocks remain safe and sound and vital. And this is where the main pathology maybe of economics is, that they have no way really of, in the current accounts, getting the real value of ecosystems in, the real value of trust and social relations in, without converting it to a dollar value.
Right.
And then you get what I call a monotheism of value. And that can even become a fundamentalism. Now, we easily see fundamentalists in like Islam fundamentalist or some kind of religious fanatics, but we don't see our own fundamentalism when it comes to reducing all types of value to money, when we do the accounts, when we do the reporting, when we do the political kind of summary or visualization of what human lives and society are all about. Suddenly we're back to dollars. which, you know, I'm not against money. I love money, but the way money is conceptualized and used in economics is pathological, because they have, again, carved out a tiny slice of what money is about and ignore the rest of what money does with your mind, what money does with the nature, what money does with our relations. So when I say money messes with your mind, that's not something you'd find on economic textbooks, because there we believe in rational individuals. And typically an economic textbook would have like 800 pages of all the different microeconomics, the production frontier and all those beautiful marginal theory, whatever. But it spends only maybe one paragraph on what money is. And in that paragraph, it says three things. It says money is a means of exchange. That's the most important. It's also a unit of account. And thirdly, it is a store of value. And economists are kind of drilled into thinking that this is money. And now they believe it, but it's a belief. And it's a very, very limited way of understanding money. Because if it's just a means of exchange, why should people get so emotional and upset about it if they don't, you know, if it's just a unit of account? And the problem is that there are, at least, which I write about in another book called Money and Soul, 3 major functions of money that are not addressed by the economic definitions of money.
Please.
Okay. So,
I'm on the edge of my seat, I promise.
okay. Yeah, maybe we get to crypto eventually, but let me do this, the psychology of money first.
Yeah.
So there is no disagreement in economics that how is money created? A little bit of it is created by fiat from government, but the most of it is created when you create credit or a loan. So if I buy a house, I get a mortgage, I get a loan, and the bank doesn't have that money. It has just a tiny bit, but it creates the money out of thin air when I sign the contract with the bank. Because now I've promised to pay it back. So now I owe you, the bank. So the money is created as a social relation. Now you have a claim on me. I owe you. It's a kind of cool way of writing money. The letter I owe you. Maybe we should use that instead of dollars. So there's 100 I owe you. Now suddenly it's clear that money creates power, because if I have a claim on you, that's power. I'm forcing you to do something. You have to go to work, you have to do whatever to pay me back. And also, of course, if a rich person meets a poor person, that immediately defines the relation. I know you're stinking rich, so I'll be a little bit timid, I'll feel a bit bad. I prefer to be along my buddies who have the same level of income. I don't mix with those rich people. So you get social stratification just on what the definition and creation of money is. So money is entering into a web of social relationships where each relation is defined by how we find ourselves in terms of that I owe you structure. Entire societies are bound together by these networks of bondages or mortgages or claims. So I can never step out of that, because who I am is defined by where I am in the economic systems of claims. That's another perspective of money. So economics doesn't touch power, because they just, it's a unit of exchange.
Right.
You're free to exchange whatever you want. You're not. You're defined by your wealth, your mortgages, by your properties, and how they relate to other people around you. So it's inescapable. Money got you. And of course, economics don't like to speak about that. You understand why, huh? But we do in psychology. And then another approach from psychology, the second definition of money that escapes economics, is that money is a tool or a very powerful tech to shape your attention. It's a psychological technology. So imagine that you're going to buy a new house, and it has an indicated price of let's say $1 million. Now you manage to buy it for 900,000. Suddenly I feel good. I feel really smart. I got this. But if it had an indicated price of 800,000, then maybe I wouldn't find that house so attractive. I wouldn't bother buying it. And if I did pay 900,000, I feel, oh, maybe I paid too much for something that's not. So this figure, 900,000 or 800,000 or $1 million, the indicator price does something with my expectations, the way I think about things. And also, if I hear somebody bidding for my house, now suddenly my house is no longer a home. It's not longer my rootedness on earth, my existential safety. It's where I really find myself connected to the larger universe. I am this person who has a home. But if it suddenly becomes a bidding round, now it's all an issue of that money, and it stops being a home and becomes a tradable object. It's a very different shift. So one final example, a famous psychologist called Daniel Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize in economics, he did a beautiful experiment, which just shows how pervasive this is. So he got 100 students to come in what he called a perception test. So there were 2 glasses of beer. And imagine at the university, if you want to recruit 100 students to do an experiment where it consists of drinking beer.
Free beer.
Free beer, not difficult to get students. Now, just behind there were 2 small price tags. One was maybe like, this is a $5 beer, and this is the one that's 99 cents beer, right? Or whatever, something like that. And then after drinking those 2, the student were asked, how does this taste? And then they described this beer A as, tingy and zingy and foamy and had depth and whatever. And the other was more bland or more boring or whatever. And then after 100 students having scored which beer was the best, he had another 100 students and then switched the price tag. And now suddenly the cheap beer that now became the expensive beer. Now that one was better. Oh, it had that, nuance to it. It had that special terroir or flavor. People came up with all funny things about this beer because it was more expensive and tasted better.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's really that simple, huh?
It's that simple. So money messes with our mind in terms of attention. What do we pay attention to? How do we pay attention? Suddenly it transforms whatever we look at from a unique phenomenon to a tradable item where you make up stories or ideas about what kind of position this has in the market. Okay, I'll be a bit shorter on the last one, which is more complex, but I'll do it briefly. So after money is an IOU, money is a tool to shape your attention globally and whatever. What more people give attention to, the more money it attracts. Thirdly, it is also imagination. And the simplest way to illustrate that is to ask, if you had $1 million, what would you do? Or the very ground of existence for banks that operate, the retail part of banks, we help you realize your dream. So come to us, get a loan, buy a house, realize your dream, or get the right car. So deep inside, we have this feeling that if I only had money, I would have the freedom to follow my dreams. And that evokes imagination, that evokes dreams, images, something I attract, something I long for. And this is where money connects to the deepest part of us, our longings, our emotions, our sense of who I could be. Money has that power. And that's why we're all stuck in it. And not being aware of the power of money to evoke images, dreams, imagination is being blind to the power of money. If we had other types of money, maybe we had other types of imaginations, other images. But since we all have just one money, we all caught in that rat race, as some call it.
Wow. I love those articulations, and it is astonishing to hear, kind of this more psychotherapy point of view applied to money. It's not something that I commonly hear referenced.
Of course, it's not in any economics textbook.
Right.
Why isn't it?
Right. I didn't go to business school, but I imagine. Well, I read on I read somewhere about you that you'd won several awards as being like most entertaining professor or whatever, and I understand that now, where the students are very much getting a great experience to learn from you in business school. So what do we do about it, Per? Like, how do we shift towards? And you referenced at the beginning of the interview in that first part, or that fifth, can't remember now.
Defense barrier, the identity barrier. Yeah.
How do we actually, can I make any contribution to can we solve climate change? Can we solve global warming? So yeah, like now that we've gone through the pathologies of economics and some of the psychological defense mechanisms that we have, what do you see as kind of the appropriate response at a collective level for whether it's fixing our economic system or changing our relationship to it?
That's a huge question, of course. And I've participated in some huge thinking too. It's something called the Club of Rome. We just published last year a book called Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity.
Nice.
Where we do a global systems modeling of all the 9 planetary boundaries and the social dynamics and economics in 10 world regions. And that would be another interview, Matthew. We don't want to go down that route, but look it up, earthforall.life, if you're interested in the broad picture. I know you're doing this series also on the issue of cryptocurrency and money. So if we stick with the issue of money, what can we do with money to help accelerate that systems change that we need?
Yeah.
So maybe the motto for this book, the Earth for All book, was like, we took the kids seriously. They were on the streets. They had placards said, "We want systems change, not climate change." But what exactly is systems change? What does it look like? What do you know? How do you know if it's a systems change in a good direction? Or maybe we are changing the system, but we're making it just worse.
Yeah.
Something we'll discover a bit later. And then also, what's the necessary speed of systems change? So how quickly do we have to change the system in order to get to a high quality of life, well-being society within planetary boundaries? All that's in the Earth for All book. What we don't address there is the issue of money and the potential for monetary innovation, cryptocurrencies, eco-coins, natural capital currency, these kind of things, because it's seen as too speculative yet. We have 5 major areas like food, energy, poverty, inequality, and empowerment of women, gender equity. These 5 we do know and we specify them. But how can we use money, rethink money to accelerate those necessary changes in those 5 systems domains? And this is where I'd like also to have more input maybe from you, because I'm still searching. But in my book, Money and Soul from 2008, I wrote about something called nature capital currency, which maybe now is better called an eco-coin. And it goes back to this magical capacity of money to influence how we understand the world. What is underestimated is to what extent accounting or changes in accounting is a psychological intervention in the organization. If you want another type of organizational behavior, well, everybody knows you can change the KPIs, but at a deeper level, you would also need to look at how you organize your accounts.
Right.
And here comes the problem, because another pathology of economics is that since money is a unit of exchange, you can use it not just for a market, but you can use it for all markets. So it's a universal unit of exchange, and that collapses all values into this monotheism of value. Now, I think with cryptocurrency, we have a huge opportunity to do a psychological intervention in the heart of economics.
Totally.
Yeah. And we don't have a lot of time to do it, but this is an incredible opportunity if we can get the right thinking together collectively and the right tech to support it, and then the right level of scale of growth. So we would, and my dream is that in addition to having monetary accounts, you would have physical accounts that, for instance, say something about the biodiversity or the biocapacity per hectare. So you now measure, or maybe a company would have to, if it makes a product, whether it's bread or toasters or houses, that has a certain footprint in the world, it would account for that footprint in hectares, or the biocapacity needed to build this house in hectares, and then also balance that account with support of nature ecosystems that counteracts that. So the building of a house or a toaster becomes regenerative. There is a better nature measured in biodiversity per hectare after the building than it was before.
Why measured in hectare versus greenhouse gases or some sort of biodiversity index or whatever?
Yeah. Carbon emissions are by nature captured through photosynthesis. Sun shines on the leaf or the grass absorbs carbon, takes it from gaseous carbon into bioactive carbon. And it has that cycle. Some of it is held, most of it is released during the seasons. So carbon balance, the carbon cycle, depends on photosynthesis, which only happens on hectares, which has a certain productivity. They may be very low, like a desert, or they may be very high, like a tropical forest. Mm-hmm. So you could, of course, use the 9 planetary boundaries and then have 9 types of currencies, one for nutrient flows like nitrogen, another for freshwater flows, a third for carbon. But another way of doing it is to look at how all these interact in a hectare. Mm-hmm. And of course, I don't have the answer. I'm trying out different things there. But imagine combining the hectare account with GIS. Now, let's say I'm a construction company, mm-hmm. and I built 10 houses last year, and that had a lot of impacts, mining, emissions. But I have also contributed to the regeneration of 130 hectares. And if you click in my account, you can see a planet.com image of those 130. I can actually follow mm-hmm. the material streams that I consumed all the way back to where it's being regenerated. Mm-hmm. That's intelligent money. Mm-hmm. Now you embed a story of regenerative work into a monetary unit that has the entire chain in it. So you're able to track how your economic activity both consumes but also contributes to mm-hmm. Earth in balance. To me, that's very exhilarating. I don't know if you get the same feeling, but maybe I'm going off of my cloud.
No. I mean, I think it reminds me of, and I want to give a shout out to the interview conversation we did with Robbie Schengler, co-founder of Planet, and someone who's really, espousing this meme around eco coins. And he articulates, very effectively the idea that at the end of a fiscal year, so to speak, when we currently balance our books and pay our taxes, that there will be a new process of balancing our natural capital books. Mm-hmm. And we'll look at the impact of our supply chain and our direct energy usage and our consumption, and we'll effectively then see, okay, like we have this much footprint deficit that we need to make up for. Yep. And then we'll go buy the appropriate, credits out on the markets, and maybe those credits are water and biodiversity and carbon. Maybe it's per hectare, some sort of value measurement, and that will help to create balances back in the inevitability that economic activity and enterprise activity is going to have an imprint and an impact on the biosphere, on the ecology that surrounds us, and that is not something that's just like some crazy idea on a chalkboard. This is being somewhat burst through the different policy implementations of what we recently saw in EU around commitments of no longer having certain types of deforestation products in supply chains, but SEC putting climate disclosures requirements on companies around scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and kind of now we have businesses especially, as well as governments, being forced to look more fully at their total footprint and to start to track and measure different things and report on that. And this is just the beginnings of maybe what the next order effect will be, which is, okay, you have a dramatic footprint. You need to offset. You need to correct it. And you need to exchange financial monetary resources in order to do so that we can move that value back into nature.
Yeah, reinvest into the natural stocks, because we have been extracting from natural stocks and just putting that on our cash flow or our P&L as a positive income without having any representation or visualization of the value we have extracted. It just magically appears as timber while the tree is dead.
Right.
So, companies have been meticulously following their cash flow. So what you were suggesting and referring to, Robbie, is that now we also meticulously need to follow our material flows. So what's the takes and the gains? How does that material flow impact the stock and the stock's capacity to regenerate those material flows into the future? It's the same thing as we did in the financial area. If I have a solid company, I have a solid financial or productive base, the machines are working, the people are motivated, human capital, big buildings, infrastructure, everything works together, all represented along with a solid financial capital. This gives a very good basis for high-performing sales and profits and a good cash flow in the future, because I have that stock upon which the flow is based. The exact same kind of thinking we could replicate in the natural area. So if I have a beautiful watershed with clean water, where I take the water to make my products, and the trees are growing, and the cows are happy, the soil is getting more humus and carbon, then I can expect material flows from that ecosystem in the future to be high quality and predictable, and I avoid shocks from either crash or some kind of breakdown. So it's not that I'm saying that all economics is wrong. Right. I'm saying it's been collapsed into one type of accounting, one type of monetary unit, one type of value dimension. And now we can learn a lot from economics. I'm also an enthusiastic economist, but we have to apply it on more domains, also the social domain. If you have a city where there is low and declining trust, people don't want to engage in politics because it's corrupt. You have to build high walls around your house because there is crime. You walk around with guns and shoot each other because there is, then the cost of running business, the cost of just contacting people, of having people gather at a conference, there's security, there's all kinds of extra added costs just to have people talk together. Now, that's a city that will have declining social relations and higher future costs also to run businesses into the future. And what we need to do is not just have people have a good day or two, but make sure that we have institutions that are robust to provide well-being into the future. And then that could also be on the books. This is other issues we've been working on. Now, it's a lot of nature here, but we also need to keep, let's say, we look at indigenous cultures. How do we make sure they are not, their knowledge systems do not disintegrate with the over-extraction, either of social or natural resources from where they are? How do we reinvest in the culture and the social trust so that we also in the future can have good profits, good business in those areas?
Right. Okay, I'm going to ask a question that gets fairly in the weeds, but I hope people stay with me for a moment, because it's a part of, it connects a few things you've said that I can't quite see how the pathway is to reconcile it. But if we need to break apart the monetary capital, the natural capital, and the social capital, so to speak, and create different instruments of value flows in each of those buckets. And then we, are doing something in the natural capital system, and we are trying to balance the books at the end, and we need to reinvest in, let's say, standing forests. There's that inevitability of converting back into that uniformity, that base layer, whatever. In this current paradigm we live in, it's usually the US dollar, right? And how do we do that without then creating effectively a price to nature, where it's okay, well, now we value the forest at $5 billion. So that means if you have $5 billion in $1, you can buy and cut down the forest, right? And I feel like the response is, well, we regulate it. But that gets exactly back to your earlier point, which is that the economics domain is leaving out the messiness of policy settings and pretending like it can just operate in this space independent. And so how do we address that fundamental issue and the fundamental issue of convertibility between these different types of capital? Follow?
I think so. I don't, this is frontier. I mean, this is
totally
nobody knows.
So fun to geek out with you on it.
So I don't know. Let me start with that. I don't know, but let me propose a few things.
Please.
So again, if we manage to keep flows and stocks distinct, then I would prefer the stocks to be accounted for in physical units. So what's the amount of biocapacity or biodiversity per hectare? These are very physical things, right? So you'd have a real mirror or a real visualization of what is the amount of available fresh water, green water, blue water in the system here? What is the exact type of biodiversity we have here? How has it been developing? And also maybe nitrogen levels in waters and soils, because that's what makes photosynthesis possible. So there are these 9 planetary boundaries that are global, but also exist on each hectare, if you will. So for me, a good accounting of let's say a property or a county or state or a nation would have physical units on the stocks. Then it comes to the flows. And you're spot on in terms of, let's say the forest is dying, we need dollars to have people go to job, they will plant trees, or they will make endemic species thrive better, or they will repair wetlands. That needs dollars because people need to pay their houses and bond and mortgages and all those things. So that's why I've been speaking about green growth at Norwegian Business School, because I think between the dollars and the physical units is something we can call integrated metrics or productivity metrics. And this is not foreign to economics. So for instance, the key productivity metric that economists use is labor productivity, which is how much value do you, Matthew, create per hour worked? So now it's not just $1, it's $1 per the hour. What we need is an equivalent approach when it comes to resource productivity. So how many dollars per ton or how many dollars per hectare? That's an integrated metric. So let's say that last year we had a carbon productivity of $2 per ton or $200 per ton. This year, we managed $300 per ton. That means more value created per ton of CO2 emitted or bioactive carbon released. So what I've done now is to link the financial flows with the stock. There's a few more ifs there, but the thing is, to achieve the Paris Agreement, we need an annual improvement in carbon productivity of about 6 to 7% per year.
How much?
6 to 7% per year. That's the minimum. So each year, from each dollar value added, we need to make 6 or 7%, preferably more, dollars per the ton of CO2. If everybody did that, then we would get much below half emissions, towards zero emissions by 2050 every year.
And what's the, out of curiosity, baseline GDP growth that indexes to, like the 2 to 3% per annum?
Exactly.
Okay.
2.5.
Okay.
Yeah. And the same thing with other materials and biodiversity. So you would have how much dollar do we create per biodiversity loss, or preferably improvement?
Mm-hmm.
And eventually by 2050, you would have companies that create $100 for each hectare they improve. They don't no longer destroy it. Now we make $100 with a negative effect. So we have a negative biodiversity productivity. We destroy productivity in order to make dollars. So maybe with the cryptocurrency system, we could have something that represents this. This is where I don't know, where would it be on the ledger? So you could see how different parts of a business or different businesses or different states, different countries compete in terms of how they relate their dollars to their physical units. That's what I call an integrated metric. And maybe also we could monetize the physical units themselves, or we could do it with a tax benefit on the integrated metric, in the sense that if we had a proper eco-coin along the type where with the GIS systems show the footprint in real terms, you could see how it was impacting the stock, and that would have a value in itself. So imagine a visionary tax politician or minister of finance in the future saying that, well, you can either pay your tax in dollars or you pay it in biodiversity credit. So now a company that's good at generating a lot of physical biodiversity credits per hectare, you get a lower financial tax with an increased payment in biodiversity credit. And suddenly they hire lots of biologists, come up with the smartest way to regenerate these ecosystems. So they are chock full of monkeys and parrots and beautiful flowers and insects and snakes and whatever.
Yeah.
When we do that, I use those coins to pay my tax, so I can pay my shareholders more in dollars. More dollars, more nature. Why not?
Exactly. I mean, this is what gets me so excited about the space is if we can change the incentive mechanisms, I do believe that we have the ingenuity as a species to change our behavior and to fundamentally restore and protect this beautiful planet that surrounds us. What I'm hearing from you and what I'm taking away from this conversation is really, standing out as the distinction between stocks and flows, and a society and a financial system that's pathologically focused on the flow and not the stock, and ruining the stock for the sake of the flow, especially in the natural capital sense. And I'm also, really appreciating your monetary or financial capital versus natural capital versus social capital, and kind of just thinking about how do we tease those apart, and maybe there's different value instruments and
currencies,
monies, and or tokens or whatever to represent activity that's happening there, and then we need to be very mindful of what are the convertibility and rules and barriers between those systems, and how do those relate to the flows and stocks. And I guess somewhat of in answering my own earlier question, like it's not something that we can just relegate to policymakers, but it also is but we are the policymakers in crypto at some fundamental level, because we are trying to create our own monetary policy for our own tokens. And I'm brushing over the tiny, tidbit detail of how to put this into the actual regulatory frameworks around securities and rules against creating currencies and all of the rest, which is in many ways still being addressed and figured out on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. But I do believe also there's a couple key other important points in my mind. One is around transparency, that what blockchain offers is by default something that really addresses a number of challenges with the opaqueness of our current monetary system. I also think it brings so many benefits in terms of the open source, or what many in crypto would call permissionless, where anyone can contribute to it. Like there is certainly lots of issues with the equitable distribution of cryptocurrency, but it is inherently something that can be more inclusive and equitable by that very nature.
In addition, just to jump in there,
Please.
is that it helps us give us new eyes. Because if you only see world through money, then your attention is determined by this.
Exactly.
And this is what economists don't get, because they would say to me, Stockness, paying your taxes in biodiversity credits or eco coins, it's just a complicated way of paying your taxes. What you should do is just put a proper subsidy on those companies that are building up nature, and you tax those that don't.
Yeah.
Case solved. And again, they are shaped by their filter of the world, which is as if this is the one unit you use to solve all problems, and they do not recognize to what extent money shapes social relations, money shapes your attention, and money shapes what you dream about.
Yeah.
So it would be a psychological intervention to have other types of currencies that would have institutional implications that they don't see because they're over-focused on supply and demand and the efficiency of the market.
Yeah.
So that's what we're up against.
Totally. I keep coming back to that Buckminster Fuller quote, to paraphrase, that it's if you want to change how someone thinks, you don't just tell them to change how they think. You don't convince them. You give them a tool that through the usage of that tool, it changes. And I feel that way about money. It's like it's messed with our mind. And if we had a different money that was more in harmony with nature, that we would actually also help get at some of these cultural and paradigm shifts of how we even think about our relationship with the rest of the living world.
Yeah, and to come with a sigh is that I've been trying to get this across to economists for more than 20 years, and I've failed. So they are programmed not to be able to see this.
And how do you, so it's very rare to speak to someone of your generation who's open-minded to crypto.
Really?
It's, I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize, but it is a striking characteristic of this Web3 crypto space that you can basically plot open-mindedness against a generational graph. And certainly people who have traditional backgrounds in academia and economics or finance. And so, you obviously are a bit of a unique individual in your field. And you have this open-mindedness, but I'm curious, if there anything that comes to mind of like the defense mechanisms of why people aren't open to these alternative systems and ideas, regardless of whether it's crypto, but just like to stretch our imaginations and to think that there's another way.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it comes back to my understanding that money is something that evokes the imagination. And that has a huge impact on how you live. But for an economist, that doesn't register into what money is. So when they see crypto, they see a Ponzi scheme.
Right.
It's a very complex, energy-consuming, resource-wasteful thing of duplicating a currency we already have.
Right.
Get rid of it. Doesn't contribute to anything, just a complex, speculative financial instrument that at best doesn't do any more harm than a lottery does. This is the kind of
totally 100%.
And it just follows logically from the worldview and the training and the narrow-mindedness, the pathology, if you will, in terms of how they were trained to think about money, and they never got any philosophical or historical or institutional questioning of that frame within money is defined. I come from philosophy and psychology. I've been trained to put a question mark at everything. And maybe that's why.
Nice.
I didn't come from economics.
Right.
I came from psychology and into economics. That's different. I have other friends who came from sociology into economics, and they're also thinking differently. But if you start with economics, if you do an Econ 101, then you do your bachelor and your master's, and then you even do a PhD and you publish paper in an American Journal of Economics or whatever, then
Yeah, I think it's a great insight, and probably can help inform how we think about education system around this, as well as for those in the crypto and Web3 space, how we communicate these things and what the learning journey and the curve is. If I may, I have one more question or topic area. I know you've been doing more direct conservation work in Ecuador and in the Amazon rainforest. And I know we don't have time to go into all of it, but I am just curious at a high level, like, what are you learning there? What are you thinking about? And what's motivating that?
Oh, yeah, I'm learning so much. First, I've been on a very high level. I've been a politician in parliament. I've been working on international corporations. I've been doing global scenarios, systems change, high-level abstract ecological economics things in this Earth for All. So I needed to just get my hands into the ground. I needed to hug a tree or just sit along a river that is alive. And I was so fortunate to get in touch with Pachamama Alliance and the work they're doing in the Pastaza region of Ecuadorian Amazon. And while I was there, the first road came to that river, and they started chopping down trees, hardwood trees down the river. So I was participating in being in an indigenous community while there were, shall we say, uproar, frustrated, despair, angry about what was now happening. And I decided, okay, I have some funds. I'm going to dig in here. I'm going to pay them more, together with Pachamama Alliance, 50-50, than they would get from cutting their trees. And then see, if you give them some economic security, they don't have to cut their trees. They can actually start to make an investment plan, what they want their community to be, and they get more paid for fighting loggers than they get from the money, the cash they will get in the hand. Then, taking these things together, the Earth for All had 5 major transformations. We need the turnarounds, as we call them: energy, food, gender equity, poverty, and inequality. So how does this look on the ground? Not just economic systems change, but how does it look with 150 people who live from fishing and hunting and there's small gardens in the rainforest? So by supporting them now, they don't have to hunt as much because their chakras are getting better, and they get some support for making fish pools so they can farm their own fish, because the fish has been overfished and is somewhat poisoned in the river from mining upstream. Similarly, they didn't have chicken netting, so the chicken would be eaten by the wild animals during the night. Now they have more chicken netting, so the more of the chicken survive, and they can eat their own chicken rather than killing the monkeys. So now the food system is getting better. They also have some support also from other NGOs in terms of solar panels. So now they have some solar energy, electric canoes, and they don't burn the diesel generator anymore to have lights. Now they have solar. So they're getting off fossil fuels to an energy system where they can rely on, of course, what's there in abundance. They didn't that before. Third, we have included women, actively supported them, so more women participate in the investment plans and the monitoring programs of the natural areas they're in. So we're helping them toward gender equity. We have supported them when they make their investment plans, but it's really up to them how they want to use this money. But a lot of it goes to the poor families, because indigenous cultures have this tradition of sharing. If you kill something big, a lot of meat, you share with everybody. It's part of that indigenous tradition of sharing. And now they share with the poor families. So those families that had the least, maybe they didn't have a good enough garden to feed their kids. Now they get extra money to buy what they need, so they also can get up to a certain level. And finally, they've been living at below $1 a day per person. This is difficult also because the government requires them to pay for the kids in the school, pay for the teacher, pay for their books. So somehow they have to get money. And now, with the funds they are receiving, that destitution, that below $1 per day, they don't need a lot of money down there. I mean, there's no shops, whatever, but you've been there. So, but at some point, let's say $2 to $3 to $4 a day. Otherwise, they can't have health service. They can't get the medicine they need, or the kids the education. So lifting them up from the destitution helps solve that as well. So in a way, now with these 5 turnarounds that are globally needed, now we can see how they kind of holographically can be replicated also on indigenous community level.
Right. And this, from the core intervention of offering more money for standing forest than to chop it down.
That's the idea, yeah. We pay them for standing forest. So the criteria is 2 negatives in a way. No road, they have to work against the road, and no logging of primary forest. Of course, they can take down trees if they need to build a new cabin or they need some firewood. It's not about that. It's about logging primary forest, which of course then satellite imagery is very good at detecting. But that's not enough. You can't just have satellite. You also need on-the-ground verification, because sometimes they need to make a new garden or the river moves. So you need on-the-ground monitoring teams that know what they do. They go there with a GPS, they document, they take a photo, they make a comment on what happened here. This is not a fire, this is a chakra. We burnt this to make a new garden. This, however, that's where a band of illegal loggers came down and they illegally cut down this forest. And here we have photos of them disappearing or whatever. So that's their job, monitoring, hunting, and land use change. And they have to report quarterly, otherwise the money stops.
And presumably this is not you coming in from the outside and saying, here are the rules, do this. It's really a co-creation process of, these are communities that have been protecting their forests for thousands of years.
Absolutely.
They don't want roads. They don't want logging of primary forests.
That's their choice.
Right. So
that's their culture.
They're doing a much better job than the rest of us at protecting. However, because of the encroachment of this current monolithic,
both politics and extractive industries.
Right. It's forcing their hand to participate in the monetary system at some level.
Yeah, and particularly if they have destitute poverty.
Right.
Because then they're forced to sell those trees.
Right.
And they're forced to leave.
How else are you supposed to get money if you live in the middle of the forest and the government is forcing you to pay in money terms to have
jobs.
Education? There's no jobs, and you're trying to make sure that you have access to basic healthcare system. So what you're offering in that case is an alternative. But of course, that alternative is funded through your generosity or the generosity of other donors. And so presumably you're thinking about, well, how do we actually create mechanisms to bring this into the wider monetary system?
Of course. Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, because, I am an entrepreneur, have a solar company, I have a little bit of money. It's very insufficient, but it's enough maybe for 1, 2, or 3 communities, but we have hundreds there. So the idea is to think entrepreneurially. How can we use these cases to develop an eco-coin that then finances the scale up to millions of hectares?
And it's happening simultaneous to this GIS data revolution of increased technologies at a decreasing cost curve. So that some of that reporting, verification, measurement can be done much more cost effectively, even though there still needs to be that recognition, especially of people who aren't as familiar with this space, of recognition that conserving a piece of land is still incredibly costly, especially when you're dealing with things like illegal loggers who, may come in with guns and the rest. It's like this is not just we put a rule up and then it automatically sorts itself out. There has to be an ongoing stewardship and responsibility that does require resourcing as well.
Yeah, but also it's typically, again, costly if you put a standard salary up there, but this is these people's lives. They do need a monthly salary to be part of the monetary team, but we're speaking about not much in terms of compared to a modern salary in a high cost country. So it's totally doable. I hesitate to say it's a high cost once you do it with a culture that has been doing this. They have been defending their territory for 5,000 years. They know their territory. They live it. They love it. They only want to be there. So it's like, it's a very different mindset than a corporate structure where you maximize labor productivity per monitoring report.
It is. We did an interview with Lynn Twist, co-founder of Pachamama Alliance, to see the origins of that organization.
Wonderful woman.
Real inspiration, great storyteller. Really a lot of fun to chat with her. We also had a great conversation with Atossa Soltani, who is the project lead on Amazon Sacred Headwaters initiative. Dedicated her life to this work and has been. Was also the founder and is president of Amazon Watch, decades building trust and doing work in the Amazon. And I guess, it's strange for, a Norwegian, an American, / New Zealand, wannabe couple of white guys to be going into the Amazonian rainforest and trying to work out the economics of conservation. But I do think that, the sheer scale is what really just took my breath away of, this isn't just, there's some indigenous peoples and they're in these remote locations, these untouched places, and there's this current question of how do they interface with the economic system. This is, what Atossa really drilled home in that conversation, that the Amazon is the heart of the planet. Like it literally functions from an organs perspective as the heart. We're talking about the most biodiverse ecosystem in the world. We're talking about intact biotic water pump that affects the entire hydrological system of the biosphere. We're talking about tens of millions of intact rainforest ecosystems, and the indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples are inhabiting these territories and facing...
And they have immense knowledge about them. The knowledge is incredible. Go on.
Totally. So it's just a moment in time where I guess, you and I are not alone. Many people are finding themselves in this discussion of the Amazon because of this shared recognition that this is a battlefront that we can't afford to lose, and that humanity is at a precipice.
Also, I think the forest is calling for us. I mean, at least it called for me. So I didn't decide I would go there. More like I had these images that came to me, and stuff of awakening, a longing for reconnecting with that vitality and that immenseness and that intelligence of that those incredible networks of beings that we. They know a lot about them. I don't, and I'm learning a little bit every day, and blown every day by what I learned.
Yeah. Well, I am very blessed to be going back to the rainforest this time to Costa Rica after we wrap up here. And I'm excited to continue to spend more time in that part of the world. It has been calling me as well as so many beautiful places on this planet. And of course, I am feeling the guilt of my carbon budget for taking all of these flights, which is a whole other conversation. Maybe you can have a bit of a couch therapy session after this and help me with my guilt.
The climate psychologist would come into action.
Yes. Are there any other final messages you want to share, Per, before we wrap up?
I think we've covered more ground than I expected, so nothing more to say. Just thanks, Matthew, and thanks for your dedication and your willingness to put time and keep showing up for this issue and prioritizing it. We need more people with a background in finance, tech, and crypto that also embrace the vitality of this entangled, magical green world.
Yeah, thank you for the work you're doing as well. Appreciate it. Well, that was a fun conversation. I'm really taking away the importance of this distinction between stocks and flows, and also how Per emphasized the different forms of capital, natural, social, financial, as a way to ensure that money doesn't become so monotheistic. I also like Per's comments about how money creation is a form of distributing power. And I respect his work in getting hands-on with conservation in the Amazon rainforest. I saw firsthand what he's doing down there, and he's really trying to make things happen. You can find links in the show notes to Per's books, his TED Talks, and other resources mentioned in today's conversation. For more conversations like this one, go to maearth.com. I invite you to like, share, subscribe, and also join our community Discord to continue the discussion. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.